France is a strange case. Most countries are blamed for their colonial policies, but France is also blamed for its post-colonial policy.
Why does the West do everything in its power to keep Africa impovered? Amidst the vast expanse of Africa, a narrative of exploitation unfolds, woven by the hands of world superpowers. They come bearing promises of progress, draped in the guise of aid and development. Yet, beneath the surface, lies a grim truth. The very resources meant to uplift Africa serve to enrich its exploiters instead. In this relentless cycle, colonial shadows loom large, perpetuating dependence through the chains of aid and external debts. Each gesture of assistance becomes another link, binding Africa to a fate of poverty and reliance. As the world watches, Africa stands at a crossroads. Will it continue to be a pawn in the game of exploitation, or will it rise to reclaim its sovereignty and shape its own destiny?
La soluzione è liberare l'Africa da certi europei che la sfruttano.
And no more to colonialism that's wearing a disguise of multinational corporations.
Si ce sont eux-mêmes les terroristes qui nous tuent aujourd'hui, ils nous pillent.
The historical exploitation perpetrated by European colonial powers on African resources and populations left deep marks that echo to this day. For centuries, these powers benefited from the unbridled extraction of natural resources, the imposition of unequal economic systems, and the cruel slave trade, perpetuating a cycle of oppression and subjugation. Although the colonial era has come to an end, the remnants of this legacy continue to shape the socio-economic realities of contemporary Africa. Many argue that the structural inequalities resulting from this exploitation persist in new forms, undermining development efforts and perpetuating the marginalization of many African communities.
There was 1 month in this continent when the Russian foreign minister was here, the American foreign minister was here, the Chinese foreign minister was here, the French president was here, the Turkish president was here, within a period of 2 weeks. What were they looking for? What is in their best interest?
Critics point to unfair economic policies and trade practices adopted by the Western world, which include an unequal trade agreement and the indiscriminate exploitation of African natural resources.
Right now, when I see the Blair Institute moving around Africa, they are implementing exactly what was in that particular report, and I have a copy of it, not for the benefit of Africa, but for the benefit of the Institute. And what they have done is to sugarcoat it and camouflage it for the purpose of hoodwinking Africa and for the purposes of creating an environment which benefits foreign companies to the detriment of the continent of Africa. So that some of these engagements are anodinal. They simply lull us into a false sense of security.
Multinational companies, often originating from Western countries, are criticized for prioritizing profit over local development. This unbridled search for profit often results in the exploitation of cheap labor, environmental degradation, and socioeconomic inequalities, contributing to the perpetuation of underdevelopment in several African regions. Political instability and internal conflicts pose significant challenges to economic development in Africa.
The institutional conceptual West, which is diabolical, and the individual members of those countries that actually sometimes are on our side. Institutionalized conceptual West, as articulated through government, is fundamentally diabolical. Their pretension to the contrary notwithstanding, and therefore when we engage with them, we must have our guards up.
Fueled by ethnic disputes, competition for resources, and external interference, these conflicts undermine regional and national stability, harming growth and development efforts. Furthermore, they cause damage to crucial infrastructure, displace populations, exacerbate food insecurity, and divert precious resources that could be directed towards sustainable development initiatives. The cycle of conflict and instability makes the path towards lasting and equitable prosperity in the region even more challenging. Libya, Central African Republic, Somalia. At first, they were all well-intentioned about their catastrophic ending.
History has demonstrated, and my good friend Kegoro said it, history has demonstrated not once, not twice, that the intentions appear to be noble in the beginning, but when they have come in like the proverbial Trojan horse, they go beyond their mandate. Show me what is happening to Libya today. Show me what is happening to the Central African Republic. Show me what is happening to Somalia today. They were all well-intentioned, and see the product. A tree shall be judged by its fruit. A mango that says it is an orange is still a mango.
Geopolitical power dynamics play a significant role in perpetuating global inequalities. The Western world's leadership in the geopolitical and economic order often results in policies that exacerbate social and economic disparities, especially in regions such as Africa. International institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund (IMF), which largely reflect Western interests, are often criticized for their structural adjustment policy approaches. These policies, which prioritize austerity measures over investment in social services and human development, tend to worsen poverty and inequality in many African nations. The result is a dynamic that perpetuates the marginalization and economic dependence of these nations on developed countries, undermining efforts for progress and self-sufficiency. Africa stands as a veritable feast for the superpowers of the world.
Let us understand that the international economic architecture, as I see it, is one in which Africa did not participate, does not participate in a meaningful way. Take, for example, the Bretton Woods institution that we know about, the World Bank and the IMF. Created in 1944 in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, British economists and American economists immediately after the World War II to target the reparation of Europe through the Marshall Plan. We are grafted into it, and then we become beholden to them. So that when you hear IMF is in your country, you ought to be very worried, because the prescriptions is one size fits all. And if you doubt me, you will remember the prescriptions of the IMF during the structural adjustment in 1980s. Not a single country came out of it in a proper shape. We are not involved in that architecture. Remember also the WTO. The very first meeting of the United Nations in 1945 in San Francisco had a component of the WTO. The WTO, as we know it today, is also constructed in a manner that does not benefit us. The idea is that Africa continues to remain a producer of primary goods, and we continue to consume goods that have value addition.
Where nations like the United Kingdom, the European Union, the United States, China, and various Arab states gather around the table to partake in its abundance. This metaphorical banquet isn't one of culinary delights, but rather of economic and strategic exploitation. These superpowers meticulously devise and execute plans for ongoing exploration and exploitation of Africa's vast resources, treating the continent as a buffet from which they can freely indulge. In this narrative, Africa isn't merely seen as a passive resource, but rather as a source of sustainability, feeding the insatiable appetites of these global giants. Its rich reserves of minerals, oil, gas, and agricultural land are eagerly devoured to fuel the economic mechanisms and geopolitical ambitions of the superpowers. Like diners at a lavish banquet, these nations compete to secure their share of Africa's bounty, often at the expense of the continent's own development and prosperity. This portrayal underscores the unequal power dynamics at play, where Africa finds itself not as an equal participant but as the main course on the menu of global dominance. The metaphorical imagery of Africa being consumed highlights the extent to which the continent's resources are exploited and depleted, with little regard for the long-term consequences or the well-being of its people. As the feast continues, the challenge remains for Africa to reclaim its agency and assert its own interest in the face of this voracious appetite for its riches. A Mozambican musician once said in his musical composition, "Your apostles spread your church. They said it's enough to have everything you want. They divided the world in Berlin at the Last Supper. Then they created the IMF. They say the world is a village. Your apostles modernized the colonial world. Now the chains are called the World Bank, bless conflicts and offer outside help. The poor are offered the gift of eternal debt, and with debt comes the blessing of dependence. African leaders kneel in your presence. For your glory they condemn children at birth. For every fortune thousands of them neglect. The greater the need, the greater the belief that only the Lord commands our existence, and the third world now dreams of the first. Turn off the television and wake up to the nightmare.